The following show is brought to you in partnership with the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History, Blue Star Strategies, Bright Road Incorporated, Make It Plain Podcast, and RPC Media.
From the campus of the University of the District of Columbia, this is State of Play.
Welcome to State of Play. I'm Sharon Pratt, and with me is Karen Tramontano and the Reverend Mark Thompson. Today we're going to talk about the rising threat of domestic terrorism. 2020 was a tough year. We've had the pandemic. We had racial unrest. We had an economic crisis. And now I thought 2021 was going to be a break. And we had an insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. And since then, Department of Homeland Security said, don't get relaxed. These folks are coming back. I can't believe it. Karen and Mark, can you believe this?
Oh, this is very, very frightening, Mayor. And, during the last 4 years, this alt-right movement was given credibility and a platform by our president, by members of Congress. And look what's happening with this new Congress. We have QAnon in the Congress now, and they're struggling to put guardrails on it. It's outrageous.
America is in a place it's never been before. You just ticked off the numerous plagues that have taken place in 2020. And you're right. You come in 2021, the first week, and you have an insurrection. So there's a lot that has to be fixed, undone. And as Karen alluded to, Donald Trump, Mayor, enabled all of this. And I dare say, you look at a lot of the people who had the insurrection and people involved in this white insurrectionist, white nationalist movement, or what have you. They got their marching orders, their inspiration from the very president of the United States. That's a serious problem. And it's going to take a while, I think, to unwind what he wound up.
But you have to wonder, Mark, as to how much he wound up and how much of it was already there. I think a few people who have come down an escalator and accuse what is the fastest growing demographic in America of being criminals. We don't want them. We want to build a wall, and actually getting his numbers growing. So there's something going on here.
Well, I would agree. We know there are things like that have always been there. But what Donald Trump did was enable it even further with his loudness, with his brashness, and with the help of social media, who up to this point had been giving him an unfettered forum. So a lot of these individuals had an unfettered forum. And, I think even though it was there was always something going on where people still had to question, is this okay? Is this how I should behave? Donald Trump sent out a signal. Yes, this is absolutely the best way to behave. Just go crazy.
Well, let's face it, the other thing that happened is in the last 4 years, these forces, these alt-right forces, have had an impact on policy. I mean, look at what we've done. We've separated children from their parents at the border. That was probably the worst human rights crisis of our modern time. And it was completely authorized. And he had someone in Miller as a domestic policy leader driving these policies to leave immigrants at the border. So they not only are they there, but they have influenced the decisions that the president of the United States could make, especially in terms of executive orders. The Muslim ban, another example of how these far-right organizations have infiltrated public policy.
I mean, and to think that they are torn about who they want to sanction, whether it's Liz Cheney, who is a bona fide conservative, or this new woman, a QAnon supporter, what is her name? Marjorie Taylor Greene. And they seem more inclined, I guess McConnell spoke out against Greene, but they seem torn about it. That really has to give you pause.
It also reveals the misdirection of the Republican Party. So prior, they might make the argument, well, we need to, kind of be neutral on this, or maybe even support a Marjorie Taylor Greene, because we know there's a powerful movement on social media and we don't want to get primary. Now, a lot of that chat has been relegated to the underground internet, so to speak. So you wonder, what are they really saying? Are they saying now that the base of the Republican Party, the majority of it is in subreddit and parlor groups? I mean, that says something about your political party if you're pretty much beholden to that. And if that's where the Republican Party base is, that party is in very serious trouble.
No, Mark, you're exactly right. I mean, they are not standing for country. They don't care about governance. What they care about is all of a sudden, all of these people have been unleashed and are voting Republican, and they just don't want to lose those votes no matter what. And they don't care what hangs in the balance in terms of our nation or civility. They will go dark and underground to make sure that they keep those votes and they keep their power. And the question is, power for what? I mean, most people, and Mayor, you were in office. I mean, most people run for office. They serve because they want to govern and they want to serve the people in their district, the people in their state, the people in their nation. This is a grab for power's sake at all costs, and a serious cost to our democracy, I believe.
No, I think our democracy is very much at risk. We talk about the Republican Party. We need to be concerned about our democracy, but I'm glad we're going to have an array of talent to help us understand it. We've got Eric Ward with the Southern Poverty Law Center coming up, and then we have Daniel Lombroso, and then we have Elizabeth Neumann. So stay with us at State of Play.
Closed captioning brought to you in partnership with the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History. Visit ipph.org for more information.
So welcome back to State of Play. We're very lucky indeed to have with us Eric Ward. He's the Executive Director of the Western States Center, Senior Fellow of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Delighted to have you with us, Eric Ward.
Such a pleasure to be with you today.
Now, I know your organization monitors hate groups. When did you decide that this white supremacist, this alt-right dynamic, was a clear and present danger to the United States of America?
So the white nationalist movement actually has its roots as a reaction to the victories of the civil rights movement. And the Southern Poverty Law Center, since the 1980s, has been raising alarms about the rise of white nationalism. But it's really in 2010 that we become significantly alarmed. What we were witnessing is an evolution of the white nationalist movement. It was beginning to talk and act in new ways. Instead of talking about taking us back to the days of the past, it began talking about creating an all-white ethno-state free of Blacks and Jews. It also began to launch an attack on women through violent rhetoric and support of anti-women organizations like Incel. The last that was most concerning was that it was calling for electoral engagement. That was a sign for us that the white nationalist movement had moved from the margins into the mainstream. For many Americans, while January 6th may be the moment where they realized that white nationalism was a risk to them and democracy, for many human rights organizations and government agencies, it is really around 2010 that the alarm bells began to go off.
Well, given the number of investigations and arrests resulting from the January 6th insurrection, do you think these groups are going to scatter and sort of take cover?
Well, what we know is that in our latest reporting, the number of white nationalist groups has actually diminished. But we should be clear that even though their numbers have dropped, it's still at an all-time high in comparison to a decade ago. But we also understand that as the movement has mainstreamed, people have found other ways to be active that are not required to be part of an organization. Online platforms, loose networks such as organizations as the Boogaloo Boys. This has protected the organizations from civil suits for engaging in violence, being held accountable. But we should be clear, this white nationalist movement and its larger alt-right coalition is not going to go away. It is a social movement that has become part of the American fabric. And it calls on all of us to think of new ways to engage this movement. We really need to strengthen democracy, and we need to draw clear moral barriers against hate.
Oh, Governor Whitmer, she was a target of some of these groups. That was a very serious threat to her life. What is the obsession with Governor Whitmer? I mean, they seem quite obsessed with her.
It is a conspiracy. And what we have to understand is that it's a nihilistic movement. And so it seeks to target those who they perceive to be most vulnerable. And they saw Governor Whitmer as vulnerable. They also saw her as a woman who didn't know her place and sought to punish her. We have seen this over and over again. We should be clear that the Congress representatives that they have most vilified in Congress, in the federal level, have also been women, primarily women of color. The white nationalist movement is a misogynistic movement. It does not support the rights of women, people of color, immigrants, or Jews. It's an exclusionary formation, and it has taken a lot of lives in America.
Do you feel that there is a growing implied support from Americans? I mean, Pew Research did a poll where they indicated 40% of Americans support some form of an autocracy. And to some extent, that's really what they're proselytizing. Do you see a confluence of these attitudes giving them more power?
Absolutely. We should be clear that the white nationalist and alt-right coalition don't bring bigotry into our communities. They simply organize the bigotry that exists. These are movements that are anti-democratic, small d. They do not believe in transparent and accountable and people-centered government. They believe in a government that serves white people and removes people of color and other vulnerable communities from the United States altogether. It's a violent movement. Over 100 Americans have been killed in the last 4 years by this movement. Over 140 law enforcement officers were injured in Washington, D.C. One was killed. And this does not even include the scores of Black Lives Matters activists who were attacked, hit by cars in demonstrations across the country over the last month.
Well, stay with us here on State of Play, where Eric Ward will continue to have a conversation with us on this very important subject. Stay here. Welcome back to State of Play. Our topic, the rising threat of domestic terrorism, and our guest, Eric Ward, with the Southern Poverty Law Center. My co-anchors have some questions for you, Eric Ward.
Thank you for being here, Brother Ward. What responsibility for the proliferation of these hate groups lies with social media?
Social media platforms bear a lot of responsibility for what has occurred over the last 4 years. For the last decade, these platforms have chosen profit, right, over civil society. Algorithms have been geared towards stirring up controversy, right, and feeding energy that leads to violence, to partisan positioning. This is how they kept people on these platforms. White nationalists took advantage of this, and they were able to take advantage of millions of Americans feeding in conspiracy theories. Social media platforms have been slow and reluctant to respond. And the cost, as I said, has been American lives. While they don't bear all of the responsibility, as a new form of technology, they showed an inability to be responsible to government, to our communities, and they have sown the seeds for much of the hatred that we see playing out on the streets of America today. Again, over 100 Americans killed by white nationalist violence, and many of those white nationalists organized on social media.
Mr. Ward, as you know, there's a debate going on as whether the U.S. needs a domestic terrorism law at the federal level. What do you think?
We have to be cautious about the expansion of the concept of domestic terrorism in the U.S. The reason why is that those laws, like most laws in the United States, are applied disproportionately by race, meaning that even the best intentioned laws significantly impact resilient and vulnerable communities in very real ways. We have laws on the books already. These laws are not being applied in a way that seeks equity. In fact, they're very disproportionate. We have witnessed over the last 11 months a disproportionate enforcement of civil rights and racial justice activists, whereas white nationalists have been treated with kids' gloves, often walking by law enforcement officers armed without being questioned, running over activists with cars. We have sufficient laws on the books now. We should be cautious about the expansion of domestic terrorism laws, particularly that empower law enforcement agencies, which has now been well documented, are part of the problem. Law enforcement, DHS, the military are all saying that there are many white nationalists within their ranks. Why would we empower white nationalists who have chosen their ideology over the concept of protecting and serving communities?
Well, Eric Ward, you are a font of information. You've certainly enriched our understanding of this very difficult issue of domestic terrorism in the United States of America. So thank you very much. And stay with us here on State of Play. We're going to continue a deep dive on this important subject. Well, welcome back to State of Play. Eric Ward was very enlightening. You know, he said that there was a problem, and at least the Southern Poverty Law Center understood there was a problem since 2010. Where was the FBI? I know Christopher Wray said something, I think it was last year, about it. I wonder where the FBI was on this subject.
Oh, Mayor, you're absolutely right. I mean, and the other thing that is quite interesting is that each one of these incidents, McVeigh, it's a one-off, and we don't mobilize for it. I mean, after 9/11, there was a mobilization, a realization of how threatened our country was, and there's no response right now.
And I think we have to be honest with ourselves as a country and as a society. The law enforcement, the culture of law enforcement is still loath to refer to these individuals as terrorists because they are not people of color. After all, we look at the bomber in Nashville, for example. That has yet to be designated itself as domestic terrorism. And so, again, I think as Eric alluded to, we've got to look at what law enforcement is doing. It's got its own cultural issues. And until terrorism is applied to all who practice it in that way, we're still going to be really sitting ducks.
Well, I thought it was sort of interesting, almost alarming, that he didn't want a domestic terrorism law, in part because of the Southern Poverty Law Center's concerned about law enforcement being complicit with this element of our society. That's a pretty unsettling observation.
Yeah, that was a heavy statement and a sobering one. So, and then what else? What else do we know? We know in a lot of these groups, you have former law enforcement, former military people. So, I mean, these are really, to a large extent, cultural and societal problems that need to be solved. Lots of conversations about communicating with young people and what have you. I mean, all of this has to happen, and it has to be all hands on deck.
Well, and we're soon going to be talking to somebody who's been embedded in one of these alt-right movements for 4 years. So it's going to be very, very interesting to hear what he has to say about what is the future. Where are we going?
No, the great thing about it, we get we have a clip from his film, and we get a chance to assess what is the motivation, what is the psychology, what is the economics of these groups. And, a lot of it also, what I find interesting is that when it's law enforcement, when it's the military, whatever the dynamic, it appears that it sort of reaffirms this notion of white male superiority. Karen, you coined it, I think, the tyranny of the white male minority rule in America. And that, I think, is what is playing itself out. As a former mayor, sometimes I'm a little taken aback when Black Lives Matter say defund the police, but you kind of get it. That so much of this oppressive culture exists within the authoritative systems of our own society.
And at least defund gets the conversation going, Mayor, even if you don't agree with the concept in general. It has started a conversation, and for that reason, I think it's been useful.
And so we're going to come right back here and talk with this filmmaker and who was embedded with the white nationalist movement.
Closed captioning brought to you in partnership with the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History. Visit IPPH.org for more information.
We willed Donald Trump into office. We made this dream our reality. Because for us as Europeans, it is only normal again when we are great again. Hail Trump! Hail our people! Hail victory!
Welcome back to State of Play. That clip you just saw was from Daniel Lombroso's film, White Noise. And we're lucky, Karen, Mark, and I are going to have Daniel talk with us now. Great to have you with us, Daniel.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us about this experience. I mean, extraordinary story that you've chronicled here. How long were you embedded in the white nationalist movement?
I spent 4 years reporting on the rise of the alt-right, beginning with Trump's election in 2016. I caught a room full of people breaking out into Nazi salutes, as you mentioned, which really clarified right away that this was fundamentally a racist movement. At the time, people were talking about it as a new kind of conservatism, but it was really more like a new American fascism. From there, I just kept going and going, Charlottesville, and then from there, another 2 years beyond that. So it was a 4-year journey across, I think, 12 states and 5 countries, and I'm happy to be on the other side of it now.
Can anybody join? I mean, can anybody walk in the door and say, sign me up?
Yes. And I think there's specifically looking for people like me, people who are young, who are eager, who are looking for a community. So I think the first thing you have to understand about these groups is that they're providing a value system to individuals. It's really a club. It's a cult. I mean, it's very similar to the ISIS narrative. When you hear about someone joining ISIS, part of it is that they believe in the ideology, but part of it too is that they want to belong to a family. They want to belong to something larger. And they really provide that to young kids like me. And it makes it especially dangerous because it becomes every part of your life. Your friends are from the movement. The way you dress is inspired by the movement. The way you talk is inspired by the movement. It just sucks you in completely.
Daniel, in watching the film, your film, what was striking was the young people. And I tend to think of young people as, I guess, progressive and more reflective of the future. And So this seemed to me a bit looking to the past. Is that the wrong sense, right sense of this, or?
I think that's true. My generation, millennials and Gen Z, are on average more liberal than previous generations, but there's still a large demographic that's becoming conservative or actually, reactionary, even neo-fascist. And, I think what it is that these ideas are really emotionally powerful. So they're appealing directly to you using social media, using Twitter and YouTube, and saying, hey, kid that's bored at home, hey, 25-year-old kid, the world, it's not the reason you're bored, depressed, lost. It's not your fault. It's the immigrants, it's the Jews, it's the Muslims. And it really hits you in a deeply emotional way, the way that, fascist movements always have. The way I describe it is that the hatred is almost like a drug. It's kind of intoxicating. And when you're around these people and when you watch the film, you see that they're really kind of drunk on the power of the racism. And it's really unsettling. One of the first scenes in the film, Richard Spencer says, stand up if you're under the age of 30. I think 90% of the room stands up. And that's what we're dealing with in this country.
Where do you think this radicalization of young people started, Daniel?
It's tricky. It's always been going on. I mean, all fascist movements have always depended on the young. Hitler had the Hitler Youth, and there's a long history in this country, in the South, of course, of people fighting in the Civil War to preserve slavery. I think now it's tricky. I don't want to give any credence to them, but there's many people in my generation that feel lost, confused. Their employment is less stable than ever. Wages are stagnating. People are less civically involved than in the past. In the past, you'd belong to church or community groups. People are not really doing that as much anymore, especially my age. And, these groups appeal to that sensibility. They give you that community. And that's why we're seeing it rising, unfortunately.
Well, just quickly, you mentioned unemployment. So how much does economics actually play a role? I know Dr. King mentioned that in one of his speeches at the Montgomery State Capitol. He suggested that it was economics that were being exploited, that radicalized whites after the Civil War. To what extent are economics playing a role here?
I don't think it's chiefly an economic issue. I mentioned unemployment less in terms of making money and more in terms of how employment in the modern world provides identity. You say, I'm a journalist at this place, I'm a whatever at this place. Right. The people in this movement, their identity is that I am a leader in X fascist movement. I'm the leader of the alt-right. I'm a follower. I think that's where it's coming from. And I think to add to that point, most of the people that I met are upper middle class. They're highly educated. I think we really have to change our perception of this movement as, bigoted Southern hicks, for lack of a better word, from a trailer park. It's kids in New York. It's, to contextualize it further, when I'm walking on the Upper East Side or in Brooklyn, I've bumped into my subjects. I mean, they're part of everyday life and all the progressive bubbles that we all know.
So with social media, we become disaggregated. You don't get to belong to an institution for a lifetime. So in this environment that's so disaggregated and segmented, is that part of the pull that, like you say, you get to belong to something? It gives you some identity?
That's exactly it. And it's not meant to condone it in any way. I mean, the views are abhorrent, they're racist, they're anti-Semitic, but they're giving you a sense of belonging in an atomized world, in a world where we all are looking for that. And, the goal of the film is to really shine a spotlight on the racism that shapes our society. And we talk a lot about subconscious bias or institutional racism, and those are harder to see. The real goal of the film is to say, actually, it's right in front of us. It's everywhere. And the film, I think, exposes that very, very clearly.
Well, I tell you, it's been a sobering. Your film is excellent. It's also quite sobering. Stay with us here on State of Play, because we're going to drill down further on this issue. We're going to talk with Elizabeth Neumann, who was a part of the Department of Homeland Security in the Trump administration and had to leave out of her frustration of the failure to deal with this force that is building in America. But we certainly understand it better thanks to White Noise, developed and filmed so beautifully by Daniel Lombroso. Thank you so very much, Dan. You were terrific.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome back to State of Play. Our topic today, the rising threat of domestic terrorism. We're lucky to have with us the former Assistant Secretary for Threat Prevention at the Department of Homeland Security, Elizabeth Neumann. It's an honor to have you with us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor to join you.
Well, you, as I believe, started out in this space with President George W. Bush, and then you joined the Trump administration. You left the Trump administration. Why did you decide to leave the Trump administration?
You know, there's a variety of reasons, but the best anecdote I can offer is that in August of 2019, we had the horrific attacks in El Paso, Texas. Basically, a domestic terrorist shot and killed 23 people with the stated intention in his manifesto to combat a Hispanic invasion, which was language that we saw the Trump campaign and the president himself use multiple times. And after that horrible event, what I saw out of the White House was a recognition that they had a political problem on their hands, but they were unwilling to actually address the threat of domestic terrorism in this country, and unwilling for the president to acknowledge his role in enhancing, pouring fuel on the fire, if you will, of that threat.
On January 6th, we had this insurrection. I guess that's the only way to describe it. And federal agencies seem to have a problematic way they responded. What is your assessment of these agencies in terms of their response? Was it just that they weren't prepared, or was it more to it?
You know, the day of, I saw some of the initial clips of protesters approaching the Capitol before things had gone awry, and I was kind of surprised at the lack of perimeter security, that the Capitol Police did not appear to have riot gear, the types of things that, given the open source intelligence that I was seeing, and I'm outside of government at this point, but I have friends that work in various open source intelligence efforts, and I was reading through the threats that we were seeing online. It was shocking to me that they weren't better prepared. And then, of course, we all saw the events that occurred. To me, it was very obvious this was not an intelligence problem. The intelligence was there, and as the days and weeks have gone by, we have further seen that there were plenty of warnings, at least internally. In my view, they probably should have warned the public too, but at least internally, the law enforcement agencies knew that this could be a violent, that there would likely be violence on January 6th. So it was entirely a lack of preparation. Somebody made an extremely bad judgment call. And then I think we're still investigating whether there's something more there, whether there might have been intentional actions taken on behalf of the federal government to prevent support once the attack started happening. There was a lengthy delay that is inexplicable in my mind in getting reinforcements to the Capitol to help Capitol Police. I will wait for the results of the investigation to understand how things went so poorly. But 20 years post 9/11, a lot of doctrine and strategy and policy and exercises and trainings that I have seen and many of the partners in this country have gone through. It just does not make sense to me that we failed so badly on January 6th.
Well, I've never gotten into the Capitol so easily as did they on January the 6th. Even when I was in office, I've never gotten into it, but that's another topic, I guess, to be explored more deeply. What about the Proud Boys and the Boogaloos? Do you think that they're going to take cover now that they're really aggressive federal investigation, or do you think we're at risk of seeing more violence?
You know, there's certainly a lot of changes in the various organizations and movements. They had been so emboldened by Trump over especially the fall leading up to January 6th. And on the other side of January 6th, as people started getting arrested, as they realized Trump was not going to give them pardons, there is a bit of fracturing. So for some, it's this disenchanted realization that Trump actually didn't have the election stolen from him, that he was not going to be the president, and he really didn't have their back, which is kind of the story of anybody that works for Trump. He always claims that he's going to be loyal, but when the going gets tough, he tends to ditch you. So they're experiencing firsthand what life with Trump is like. But there are others who are pivoting away from being Trump focused, supporting Trump, and pursuing their cause for different ideological purposes. So the white power movement was never really about Trump. It was much more about advancing their white supremacist agenda, and they thought they could use Trump to help their agenda. But at the core of their belief system is this idea that they want to be able to overthrow the US government and establish their own white nation. So you saw some of them on January 6th on camera, personally, saying like, I'm not here for Trump, I'm here for the white power movement. Then you have others that, like the Proud Boys, that are much more tied to Trumpism. And we're kind of watching and seeing if that turns into something else, if they follow the route of maybe a white supremacist or anti-government extremist movement, or if they just fall away and hopefully fracture and don't become a big problem. But there's no doubt January 6th was a changing moment for us, and it's going to be quite difficult for security services in the near future.
Well, stay with us. State of Play will be right back with former Assistant Secretary Neumann. Welcome back to State of Play. The topic, the rising threat of domestic terrorism. We have with us Assistant Secretary Elizabeth Neumann. My colleagues have a couple of questions.
Secretary Neumann, how do we reconcile that those who are meant to protect us in law enforcement, in the military, are joining some of these white domestic terror groups that are meant to harm us?
Such a great question. And I think for all of us, January 6th, it just further re-emphasized this disparity between how law enforcement services treat white violent extremists versus, even some that were in the protests of the summer that were not violent at all. It really was heartbreaking. It's hard to know, and we'll let the investigations show us whether this was just unconscious bias or a willing blindfold eye, or if there was something more nefarious. But what we do know from all of the data and the research that has been done is that the white power movement has intentionally tried to recruit people coming out of law enforcement and military services, so retired people. And then they've also tried to encourage their adherents to go into the military, to go into law enforcement, so that they had people on the inside. We've known that this was a problem since the 90s. There are programs in place that are supposed to help screen and check to make sure that individuals aren't associated with violent extremist organizations. But clearly, we have a lot of work to do. I feel a lot of confidence that in the Biden administration, they are putting people in roles, the Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General, who are going to take this problem seriously, perhaps for the first time ever. And I feel comfortable that given some time, we should be able to do a better job than what we have in the past.
Assistant Secretary Neumann, what should we be doing as U.S. citizens to counter this domestic threat?
I'm so glad you asked that question. It's kind of near and dear to my heart. So the day that we're recording this, there is a national threat advisory bulletin that was put out by the Department of Homeland Security that alerts the public to the ongoing threat that we face from domestic violent extremists. We expect that there will likely be more attacks in the near future. So I would encourage Americans to go and read that bulletin. It has a number of things that we, the public, can do to help keep us safe. One of them is see something, say something. Another is if you are engaging with people in your life who perhaps they're disheartened, perhaps they were QAnon followers and they realized QAnon failed them. It was not what that they were deceived, or perhaps they were a Trump follower and they're very disappointed that the President Trump is not president anymore, and that maybe they still believe that the election was stolen. Maybe they're not sure. What we're seeing is that there's a large group of people in our country that are very disheartened. And we are also seeing white supremacists try to go after them and recruit them. Anytime you have somebody that's vulnerable, it makes them vulnerable to that recruitment to a dark path. What I would encourage is that if you have somebody in your life, maybe you haven't talked to them in a while because they went too far down the QAnon rabbit hole, now might be a good time to reach out to them. Let them know you care about them, give them empathy, and maybe help them on the pathway to healing. This might be a really good opportunity to help some of those back to reality.
Oh, we really appreciate your insights, Assistant Secretary Neumann. Just terrific. And everyone, stay with us here on State of Play as we drill down further on this important topic of domestic terrorism.
Mr. Ward, as you know, there's a debate going on as whether the U.S. needs a domestic terrorism law at the federal level. What do you think?
We have to be cautious about the expansion of the concept of domestic terrorism in the U.S. The reason why is that those laws, like most laws in the United States, are applied disproportionately by race, meaning that even the best intentioned laws significantly impact resilient and vulnerable communities in very real ways. We have laws on the books already. These laws are not being applied in a way that seeks equity.
Yeah, that was a fascinating response to your question. But what he said was real, because we know how many of these organizations where there's overlap between police institutions and the military and some of these domestic terrorist organizations. And that was his point. You're right. I don't know what you do with that. How do we protect ourselves? How does law enforcement protect us if there is that overlap?
You know, I just keep wondering, what is it that we should be doing as citizens? I just feel at a loss. We need to be doing more. And I know that Elizabeth Neumann talked about talking to your neighbor, and Dan Lombroso said, you know, he was in Brooklyn and on the Upper East Side bumping into his subjects of the film. So they are our neighbors. But, you know, when Eric Ward said we shouldn't go further on legislation, it's like, okay, then what steps do we take? What should we be calling on our leaders to do? I mean, it did leave me a little, not hopeless, but feeling somewhat helpless of the circumstances we have.
Our struggle is with disinformation. And there's a culture out here that is convincing them that they are a threat, that all of these other demographics are an existential threat to them. And it's just not true. So, you know, micro neighbor, but macro, I think, Karen, the conversation has to be a conversation about confronting and ending disinformation.
Well, Mark, I mean, that is empowering, right? Because that, I think, as a society, we can do. I mean, we need to, I believe, regulate social media more. I mean, they are a public utility. They should be treated as such. And we should be able to have strong, factual, direct information out there in the public discourse where people can, you know, deal in facts and not fiction. And that does give a sense of empowerment of what we can do as a society.